Hi and welcome. My name is Alex Lutnick. It is really an honor to be able to share the findings from this research with you. I am recording this on the 1st of November, 2024, and I am located in the Bay Area of California in the United States. I use the pronouns she, they, and y'all. I have shoulder length, brown and silver wavy hair, lighter in complexion with freckles, and I'm wearing a top that has little crabs on it. And behind me, as sort of the virtual background, I've got some younger redwood trees, the picture that I took not far from where I live. And I want to take, it's about an hour, maybe a little bit less, to share research findings with you. And I'll go into the why that we did this and the methods used, some key findings, as well as recommendations. And although there are slides that I am using, there is nothing on the slides that will not be spoken aloud. So if you're someone who moves through the world with different abilities with vision, just know that everything that's on the slides will be said out loud. And so if for whatever reason, looking at the slides is not an option for you, it's okay. To begin, anti-trafficking conferences and convenings are more often including survivors, those of us with lived experience in planning committees and or event design and implementation, including us as speakers and panelists, even keynotes, and leading up to Survivor Alliance's World Congress, which took place the beginning of October 2024 in Nairobi, Kenya. Survivor Alliance brought me on to assist with research to examine emerging best practices and approaches for survivor designed, lived experience informed convenings in the anti-trafficking sector. Specifically, what's been happening, what's been working well with that, and where are the opportunities for improvement. I will name upfront, I do have my own lived experience with trafficking. And in some ways, what I'm going to say next also links to the findings. And I do like to position it at the very beginning of just because I have my own lived experience, that in and of itself does not mean I know anything about anyone else's. And in some ways, that's the beauty of research because it allows us to hear from a variety of folks. And all of us who move through the world with lived experience make meaning of and draw conclusions from our experience in different ways. So I can't presume to know anyone else's experience just because I've had my own. Let's talk about the methods a little bit. And I will preface saying the purpose of this presentation is to give you a taste of what is in the full report. And my hope is that by sharing this, that it will inspire you, pique your curiosity to check out the full report. So I'm not going to go into as much detail as I do there. And this is the top level key points. What did we do? So what we did is we meaning I, conducted 10 in-depth interviews with people involved in convening anti-trafficking conferences. These were people located around the world. All of the interviews were conducted in English, though, recorded via Zoom and transcribed. We also did, myself and someone else who had been working with Survivor Alliance, 2 focus group discussions. I conducted one, the other person conducted the other with the planning committee members of the World Congress. Similarly, those were recorded and transcribed. And the purpose of transcribing them is then it allowed me to do analysis of those qualitative interviews, so the open-ended, more conversational style, and then use the findings, the emerging findings from that, to help create the online survey. So the online survey was informed by those qualitative interviews, and it was distributed to members of Survivor Alliance, as well as folks who identify as allies who are part of Survivor Alliance's listserv, and then other key stakeholders. And those were people known to me and known to other people. I do want to highlight that there were some, which is true of all research, there's some limitations about the survey that I want to draw attention to from the get-go. The first is that there was not the budget to pay everybody who completed the survey. That is definitely not a best practice. It's what it was, it's what I had to work with, so I worked with it. And the decisions I made because of that informed what the survey could do. Knowing that not everybody would get paid, I wanted to really ensure that this survey would not take more than 10 to 12 minutes to complete. That felt like a fairer approach, knowing that people would be doing this largely without compensation. So that means I couldn't ask as many things as maybe I wanted to or get into as much depth. The other thing that we did is that because not everybody could get paid, we still wanted the possibility that some people could get paid. So we set up a random drawing for one of two $25 gift cards. And because the survey was anonymous, meaning no one put in their name or other information that could directly link back to them, what I did was at the end of the survey, a prompt came up saying, if you want to be entered into a random drawing for this, please email me being Alex, and let me know. So that way people's names stayed separate from their responses. And then we did do the random drawing. So two people did receive the $25 gift card. And then lastly, in terms of methods, when there's the time to do it this way, it definitely is a best practice to then circle back once there's a draft report, circle back to the people who were interviewed, do a presentation to get feedback. And I was able to do that. I presented this at the World Congress and am grateful for the input and insight that people who attended that presentation provided. I was also able to have informal conversations during the World Congress with other attendees that I could then weave back into the report when I returned home. And then I also sent it to the planning committee members and the people who I did one-on-one interviews with to get additional feedback. I do want to share a little bit about who completed the survey. I know not all of us love numbers and statistics and percentages, and that's okay. I also know it's really important to position the findings within the community from which it came. The reality is, to date, and likely in the indefinite future, it is not possible to have a survey, a study that is representative of all people who work in the anti-trafficking sector or who have experienced trafficking. And so because of that, we need to be really clear about where the data came from, because people who didn't participate might have offered different perspectives. I will say the survey was translated into Hindi, Bangla, Portuguese, and Spanish in hopes that it could be more accessible. Overwhelmingly, the majority of people did complete the survey in English. 68% of those who completed the survey, and I'll say there were 137 people who completed the survey, 68% were between the ages of 25 and 44. Slightly more than a third were currently living on the African continent, around the same in North America, and then smaller percentages in Asia, Europe, and South America, 16% in Asia, 6% in Europe, 3% in South America. 82% of the 137 people reported that they belong to communities that face marginalization and discrimination. The three main communities identified by respondents were being Black or a person rich in melanin, moving through the world with a disability, living with a disability, and being part of the LGBTQI+ community. And then lastly, 70% had attended at least one anti-trafficking conference or convening. And that's important in two ways. One, it means a majority of folks had the ability to provide feedback about what their experiences have been like at a conference. But also, it means we didn't really get a large percentage of people who've never been to a conference. And there might be certain important elements there to explore in the future of who is disconnected from these spaces or who does not have access, even if they're aware of the conferences. I want to share a little bit about the demographics in terms of people's lived experiences. So 91% reported having ever experienced trafficking. Almost everybody who completed the survey has experienced trafficking at some point in their life. And 1/3 of those people indicated that they've endured more than one type of trafficking. Across the respondents, the median number of types of trafficking experience was 2, with a range of people saying, I've only experienced one type, to some people reporting up to 8 different types. 89% of folks also identified as survivor leaders, and 94% were members of Survivor Alliance, with 78% indicating they belong to at least one other survivor-led organization. Again, this is a sample of people who are very engaged. So we want to remember that as we think about the findings that are emerging. And then I also want to highlight how 82% said that they're involved professionally in the anti-trafficking sector. And of those who have experienced trafficking, 82% also reported involvement professionally. And I have an asterisk at the end of that finding because we're going to come back to it in the discussion about what has emerged from the one-on-one interviews, the focus group discussions, and the survey data. Because often in our anti-trafficking spaces and movements, there's this false idea of a binary. If you either have lived experience or you're a professional who's an ally. And clearly this finding really questions and challenges that and points out how that's not always true. Let's move into key findings. If I remember correctly, I have this broken into 4 different slides. And the first is going to be about survivor lived experience involvement. You'll notice I move back and forth between those terms because not everybody with lived experience identifies with the term survivor or victim for different reasons that are beyond the scope of this presentation. And so I try my best to utilize the different terms that are used within our communities to make it more accessible. What did we find with these interviews and with the survey data? So thinking about the past 20 years, which is around just about the amount of time that conferences that are specifically named to address anti-trafficking efforts have been happening, it appears that significant progress has been made in terms of including people with lived experience as speakers, panelists, planners. And with that said, it varies across conferences, how people are involved, the number of people who are involved, and also the ways in which they have this decision-making power or not. What came through is that across the board, there has yet to be an experience of a conference where people with lived experience were involved in the very early stage planning. That moment where decisions are being made about whether to have a conference, what the focus should be, where the venue should be, the schedule, who to invite. And that's a key opportunity for improvement. I'm pausing in this moment because I want to sort of stay in this linear form of thinking and wait for recommendations until I've presented all the key findings. So I've caught myself wanting to jump ahead there. So I'll pause and talk about planning committees. That seems to be the newer trend where some conferences have planning or advisory committees comprised of either entirely or in part people with lived experience. However, the level of involvement and decision-making power they have varies greatly. Some conferences involve these committee members more deeply and have a very clear structure and schedule where their guidance is asked for on all aspects of planning the conference that's already been identified that's going to happen and executing it, perhaps helping identify speakers and giving suggestions about how to pace the gathering. Also, in some situations, providing post-event reporting. And among all the interviewees, and also talking to people who've been on planning committees and hearing from folks at the World Congress, when these committees have been used, none of them existed independently from the conference host organization, and none had full decision-making power. Likewise, all of the people reported, be it the folks who are convening the conferences or people who are part of these committees, that at times decisions were made prior to or during the conference that were not informed by the planning committee and also were not communicated back to those members. And it appears that this reliance on a host organization's agenda limits the effectiveness of these committees and can result in a dynamic that, as one interviewee I spoke with described, quote, wasn't empowering or trauma informed. I'm pausing because there's another quote I think I do want to share in its entirety. It's a little bit longer, but it really speaks to what seems to be the trend with planning committees of having sort of robust involvement at the beginning and then things going sideways and harm occurring, misunderstandings occurring as a result. So this is a longer one, and I appreciate your all's patience as I read through it. As a member of the planning committee, I appreciated our involvement in the early stages. However, as the conference approached, our engagement seemed to taper off. This lack of involvement led to a few challenges, particularly when participants at the conference asked questions about per diem or allowances, which I was not fully equipped to answer. While I addressed as much as possible, a collaborative discussion around these topics could have been helpful, even with budget constraints. So, pulling out of the quote for a minute, that person is acknowledging that in their role as a planning committee, a lot of their time was compensated, and that it reached a point where that budget had been spent down. So there was no further funding for their involvement. And they're saying, even with that being true, it still would have benefited the experience for the communication to continue so that there was clarity around what was happening and how to respond to attendees' questions. Because what we're noting and seeing is that when there are planning committees, they're often held up and acknowledged, as they should be, by the host organizations. And that signals something to attendees, meaning these people were key decision makers and will have the answers to the questions I have. But that's not always true. Okay, moving back into the quote. Additionally, we were not aware of the program and changes which were made to the program schedule, which led to many questions from attendees. I often found myself without answers, and it gave the impression that the planning committee was making these changes, though we weren't involved. A reporting mechanism for the planning committee would have been helpful to ensure that we were aligned and could provide accurate information. The person continues, as a planning committee, we had suggested for longer breaks, and the sessions were going past hours, which brought other questions to the planning committee. Again, I didn't have answers. Overall, I didn't feel the impact I hoped for as a planning committee member. We're going to, in the next slide or two, talk about pacing, because that is definitely a theme. And in this moment, what I want to say to sum up that quote is when there isn't clear, consistent communication throughout the process, it creates dynamics that can lead folks to feeling less than empowered or engaged or valued, and can set up dynamics where they're being turned to and toward as folks who have answers. And for many of us, myself included, there can be a deep discomfort when I'm not able to answer questions that come to me. Lastly, in terms of survivor involvement, we wanted to explore any type of financial or logistical support that was being provided. Again, there's a very broad range from some conferences aren't covering any expenses, or maybe they're just covering it for folks who are designated speakers, or they're going to cover registration fee, but not any travel or accommodation if it's a in-person gathering. And then other conferences are trying to cover all the expenses for people with lived experience. So registration and hotel and travel, as well as a per diem. There are some conferences I would suggest from the interviews that I did, those 10 one-on-one, as well as the focus groups, and then looking at the survey data, that in general now, most anti-trafficking conferences have some type of emotional well-being support made available. That's particularly true if it's in person. And even those that have been happening in the virtual space, online only, some are still trying to provide that type of support. And it looks a number of different ways. Some have models where people with lived experience, survivors, are providing peer emotional support and they are not being compensated for that. Others have sort of a hybrid where they've got peer support and also licensed therapists who are providing support. And in those models, in some situations, both groups are being paid. And in others, it's just the licensed therapists who are being paid. And then the other iteration of that model is it's only licensed therapists. And all of those situations, to my knowledge, those people were paid for the time that they spent providing support and being on site if it was on site. One person who responded to the survey talked about how when there isn't and we're going to get into inclusivity in the next slide, but when there's not a more robust covering of fees for people to attend, the ways in which that prevents a more diverse group of folks with lived experience to attend, but also questioning how money's getting used. So this person wrote about the frustrating reality that in their perspective, organizers, hosts of conferences are charging a considerable amount for people to register for the conference, and yet they seemingly don't have the means to support people with lived experience to attend. And this person wrote, I've felt the financial strain of trying to be present at these conferences and organizers looking the other way, even though I did the math on how much they were charging for the conference versus the cost to put it on. They've created barriers and excluded many survivor perspectives because of it. So let's move to inclusivity and diversity. That quote takes us very nicely into that. Overwhelmingly, what I heard across all the interviews and what came up in the survey data and also was brought up at the World Congress was a continued need for broader inclusivity. In particular, people highlighted the ways in which folks who have lived experience who are from less resourced regions often are not present in these spaces. Could also be members of the LGBTQI plus community and people who are newer to conference and convening spaces remain underrepresented. Some folks named how it's reached the point in the anti-trafficking sector and movement that it seems like the same voices, the same people are given those positions to attend and be paid at the sake of creating opportunities for those newer to the space who are wanting to try it on to have the opportunity to be present, to share their perspectives, and to also have the mentoring and support needed to step into those roles. There's also the reality that what was true at the beginning of anti-trafficking efforts remains true in some spaces, which is a performative inclusion. So some conferences will highlight how, oh, we have a peer speaker, we have a survivor speaker, or, oh, we had an advisory committee. And yet, in those roles, people with lived experience really didn't have substantive involvement. So it's more this performance and projection by host organizations of conferences and convenings, trying to almost virtue signal of, oh, we're informed by lived experience. And yet when you actually hear about what happened behind the scenes, or you look at how the conference was implemented, you realize, oh, folks with lived experience actually didn't have meaningful involvement. Just want to pause and see if there's anything else that I want to say about that in this moment. I think that's okay for now. Okay. You'll notice my styles. I will often pause, and it helps me just keep my nervous system regulated and listen deeply, make sure, and also try to be attentive to my pace. I know this content can bring up lots of different feelings for a lot of us, and that's okay. And when I can be intentional about my pace, it helps me stay regulated, and I hope it also helps for folks who are listening or watching to stay regulated. In this moment, I will say at the end, I'm going to share my email address so that way if there's any type of tending to that you're wanting or needing, there's an option for that, but I'll share more about that at the end. Let's talk about the key finding of safe and inclusive spaces. So we already talked about inclusivity in terms of what roles people with lived experience have. But there's also how do these conferences, how are they structured and how are they implemented to create a sense of belonging and inclusivity for people attending? So it's slightly different. What I heard across the board through the different interviews and the surveys and additional feedback, that there are certain critical elements. So to start, one of the critical elements named was having clear codes of conduct, including, and this often, from what people have named, is a piece that goes untended to, steps for how to respond when those codes of conduct are violated. People also named how important it is to have trauma-informed approaches. We're going to talk in a minute about healing-centered engagement, because what I have noticed to be true is there's a certain language that gets used now in a lot of the anti-trafficking spaces and conferences that is the agreed upon language, sort of the best practice language of inclusivity and trauma-informed. And then when we ask people what that means and how that plays out in their conferences, the responses are wildly different. So trauma-informed, unless I'm going to ask somebody, what do you mean by that? In itself doesn't mean anything. And what has been happening within anti-trafficking conference spaces is often trauma-informed means one of two things. Either it's we're giving trigger warnings at the beginning of presentations about content, and or there's some type of emotional support, psychological support being made available for people with lived experience. This is where healing-centered engagement is going to be helpful to talk about. We'll get to that in a minute. There also need to be security protocols beyond clear codes of conduct. What are the protocols needed for the particular space, the venue where it's being held? And also a commitment to accessibility. And accessibility means lots of different things. There's is the venue, are the accommodations, if those two things are separate, accessible to folks who have a range of mobility needs. There's the physical accessibility. There's also the language interpretation. How is the conference attending to the reality that folks are showing up with different first languages and different language proficiency? And how do we make this accessible in real time to folks whose language of comfort, right? A lot of people are multilingual, and there's, for most of us, a language that we prefer, that's what's being offered if something else is being presented in a different language. There's also the attuning to neurodiversity. Are things structured in a way so there's different presentation styles and session styles, recognizing that certain formats work better for some people and not so well for different folks? And also attending to cultural and religious practices and calendar dates. There have been a number of instances now where conferences are held on key religious holidays, non-Christian holidays, and in none of those situations was there an acknowledgement of it or an opportunity for people to gather and learn about it or to celebrate. And people named how, when that's happened, they immediately feel like they're not actually someone who's welcomed or that they fully belong, because an important part of their identity is not being attended to. Then there are also the accessibility aspects that need to be tended to that are a direct, trying to think of the best language here. They need to be attended to because of people's lived experience with trafficking. So in interviews, as well as in the survey data and at the World Congress, it was named how sometimes the hotel where people are being housed for a conference is happening at a different site, reminds people of hotel spaces where they were exploited. There's at least one conference that was held knowingly at a hotel where someone actually was exploited and trafficked. And even though it was brought to that host organization's awareness, attention, that was true, and therefore people would not attend because it's where they'd been exploited, they proceeded to have the conference there. That's a major issue. I mean, I do recognize that for those of us who have had exploitation happen in hotel settings, it can be difficult to find hotels that aren't going to evoke, for at least one person, memories of exploitation. It's very different to knowingly host something at a space where someone actually was exploited, when you know that was true. Definitely not a best practice. There's also the need to make sure that the venues, the hotels, include free Wi-Fi access. So people who are traveling to be somewhere often don't have the ability to pay out of pocket for that. And if they're in a space that's new to them, perhaps even a different country, it can be deeply unsettling to not have access to the information and communication styles that you want and need. And then also giving thought to, if a conference is happening in a space that's different than the hotel, than the accommodation setting, how far is it? And will all people be able to get there from the hotel to the venue? And there have been a number of conferences that people spoke to in their interviews saying, the where the conference was held was far enough away from the hotel that if you couldn't walk, you weren't going to be able to get there unless you paid for a taxi or some other form of transportation, and the conference didn't cover that. Or I could walk, but I was in a country that was new to me and I didn't feel safe doing that. So those are all things that we want to think about in terms of what makes a space actually safe and accessible and inclusive. I'm going to transition into healing-centered engagement. None of the interviewees, none of the planning committee members in the focus groups, none of the survey respondents used that term. And yet, what I was hearing across the data really was speaking more to healing-centered engagement than trauma-informed. And again, right, trauma-informed people say, oh, well, they had a quiet room or they had a licensed therapist. But for me personally, this is one of the respondents, I don't want to go into a room that people can see me going into that indicates I need some type of support. Or I don't want to talk to somebody who I've never met before as a therapist. Like it takes time to build trust. So those aren't in and of themselves necessarily trauma informed across the board. For some people, they are, and they're important. And the beauty of research is it highlights the nuance. And so that's not going to work for everybody. Healing-centered engagement, it might be a term that's newer to some of the folks watching or listening to this presentation, focuses on creating supportive and transformative environments for individuals who've experienced trauma. Unlike traditional approaches that mainly address the symptoms or consequences of trauma, such as we're going to have a therapist on site, great, and healing-centered moves beyond that, and it's engagement that emphasizes each person's holistic well-being. It recognizes that healing is not just about this idea of fixing what is broken. And I don't love the idea of brokenness. For me, the traumas I've personally experienced cause harm. I'm not broken, right? These are things that have happened to me. Other people might identify with the language of brokenness. And sometimes the language we have to describe these somatic, these embodied experiences is incomplete. So again, I'm just trying to weave in different words and terms to hopefully meet more people where they're at. But with healing-centered engagement, it's about nurturing the strengths, identities, and capacities of individuals. So this approach stresses the importance of creating spaces where people feel safe, valued, and empowered to fully participate. And if we think about that sentence and then think back about what are some of the critical elements that support safe and inclusive spaces, we can begin to bring a more critical lens to the spaces we've been in, the conferences, and see where they've missed the mark. I'm a firm believer in the iterative process, meaning that it's the rare occasion that a conference is going to happen without some harm being experienced, because we each as individuals show up as ourselves, and it takes a long time to build foundations of trust. And oftentimes conferences don't have the time to do that before everybody comes together. And yet, if conferences are more attuned to and committed to healing-centered engagement and thinking about what is it going to take for people to feel safe, valued, and empowered to fully participate, a lot of the issues that are being named in the data where things have gone wrong, sideways, where things have missed the mark, could absolutely be avoided. So healing-centered engagement encourages the development of a sense of community and shared purpose, where participants can connect meaningfully with each other and develop a shared sense of hope and possibility. Connected with all of this, what makes a safe space, what attunes to our holistic wellness, our holistic well-being, the thing that came up in so many of the interviews, the survey data, and throughout the World Conference is pacing. Pacing of conferences has been identified as a critical factor in supporting the holistic wellness of all participants. This means having adequate breaks, non-negotiable breaks, wellness spaces beyond the we've got a quiet room or we have on-site therapeutic support, also emotional support. Those are key elements to prevent burnout and ensure meaningful engagement. The findings also highlight the importance of building in time throughout the conference where people can have the space to reflect, can have informal connections and conversations with other attendees, and the opportunity to integrate what they're learning and hearing and processing. It's sort of innumerable, the number of folks who spoke to pacing as a critical element in conference design, and I'm pausing to think about the best language here, and would go on to say, and yet time and time again, even with that input, and we can think back to that quote that was shared earlier of don't cram so much in, build in more time than you think you need for breaks. Maybe don't make sessions as long or longer than an hour, hour and a half. Time and time again, conference organizers are opting for the model where the schedule is overly full. And I do understand the tension of to put on a conference takes a lot of resources, time, emotional and physical labor, financial resources. It's a big investment. And it seems the default has been for many, many years, and this is true beyond the anti-trafficking space. Because of that, we're just going to cram it full. But if we take a step back, and this is getting more into recommendations, so I'm going to be brief here, and think about, and maybe this is the way to frame it around a key finding, what is the hoped for outcome and goals of bringing people together? What I've heard from people in the interviews is it's rare that the hoped for outcomes and goals actually are best supported by a schedule that's crammed full. So I'll pause there until we get to recommendations. And then the last key finding that I want to spend some time with is this false binary of someone's a survivor or an ally. Those two terms are not mutually exclusive. It overlooks those who are both, people who have lived experience and are also allies. It overlooks the reality that I could have, and I do have lived experience. That in and of itself does not make me an ally to other people with lived experience. It takes more than that. And it could be that somebody who doesn't have lived experience feels like a safer, better fit to a different person with lived experience than I would feel. Based on our intersecting identities, I am more than just my lived experience. And I show up with all my other identities. And some of those other identities might be more important to somebody else. And also, as I started the presentation, just because I've had my own lived experience, that means I can speak to my lived experience, but I can't speak to anyone else's. In this role, I can as a researcher because I benefit from hearing the stories and perspectives and feedback from a lot of different folks with lived experience. But unless someone else with lived experience is specifically seeking that out, they're not going to have that to bring with them. I'm going to pause and see what else might want to be said around this. The other thing to name is that not all of us with lived experience are going to center that, and it's not going to be known in a public way. And those folks are still making meaningful contributions to the anti-trafficking sector. I'm thinking about one particular interview, and the person, this is someone who hosts an anti-trafficking conference. When I asked them, is the conference informed by people? Do you have committees or input, decision-making power among people who have lived experience? This person said, well, yes, but the public's not going to know that because these are people on staff who have lived experience, but they're not public about it. So we're not going to, as an agency, say this is, survivor-led and informed, even though it is. And to me, that's really important. It highlights well, I'm going to pause again because it's getting into recommendations. You're getting a sense of how my brain works. I want to sort of take a finding and then jump into the discussion about it. Um, so I will catch myself and I will pause and I will say, we want to remember the earlier finding that among survey respondents, 82% of those who've experienced trafficking also report involvement in the anti-trafficking sector. So these aren't mutually exclusive categories, and also that just because somebody has lived experience or does not have it, in and of itself does not make them an ally. There are other things that people have named needing to see and experience in community, in connection with somebody, to feel like they're an ally. Okay. Guess I'll wrap that up by saying, by acknowledging that many people hold multiple roles, sometimes as lived experience experts, as survivors, as professionals, as allies, and holding those roles simultaneously. I do hear from people across the board that conferences have an opportunity to really improve upon the ways they create and foster a more inclusive and supportive environment that reflects the true diversity of experiences within the sector. And the unfortunate reality is, for those who are attending our conferences who do not have lived experience, they often have lived experience of other types of trauma. And what I have heard from those folks is they feel like there is not the opportunity for them to also have the support they need. There's not that healing-centered engagement and commitment to their well-being that would be really helpful. Let's move to recommendations. I think similarly, I broke this into 4 slides. We're going to start with Survivor. I tried to follow the same format as the key findings. And it's thinking about embedding survivors, people with lived experience, in the planning process. So one of the key takeaways, and I have a feeling for those who have watched/listened up until this point, you're already jumping to the, oh, this is how we could make things better. Here's how we could improve upon this. This would be a good recommendation. So I'll be curious if you want to provide any feedback, if these were the things you thought would come out of this in terms of recommendations, or if there are other things you thought you would hear but you haven't. Involving people with lived experience in the pre-planning, like the pre-planning, is a key gap still. The moment where it's, do we need a conference? Should we have a conference? What's the hope for outcome? Who do we want to invite? Where do we want to host it? What geographic location? What venue to use? Where should we house people? And having people with lived experience in decision-making roles and agenda setting would be a growth opportunity. With that, there needs to be consistent and clear ongoing communication about people's roles and responsibilities and decision-making powers and expectations from the beginning. And not a one way, not a, oh, we're the host organization, here's our expectation for you as this committee of folks with lived experience, but also for the folks with lived experience, what are our expectations of the host organization? And what is the process if any of us in any of these groups feel like the commitments that were made and our understandings aren't happening? How do we come together and attune to when things go sideways? And then how do we ensure that when the conference is happening, there's again clear communication about what role planning committee members have made what decisions have been made that disregarded their input. And if there's questions about certain aspects, who are the best people to go to? This would go a long way to minimizing the ways in which many planning committee, advisory committee members have spoken to the ways that they have felt disempowered, ultimately not listened to, and that the ball has been dropped at different stages of their involvement. The other key recommendation is the crucial aspect when conferences are being held in community in a specific location, geographic location, that locally based key leaders and community based organizations be actively involved, starting from the pre-planning through the planning through the implementation. And where that has come from as a recommendation is people have named that when conferences have missed the mark in terms of really being inclusive and welcoming of cultural, religious diversity, where conferences have missed the mark because they've chosen to have accommodations that didn't include Wi-Fi or access to potable water, or were a significant distance from the conference venue that folks couldn't get there safely or easily or at all based on mobility needs, or that decisions were made to host a conference at a hotel where someone had been exploited. All of that could have been avoided if locally based key leaders, community-based organizations had been involved and had decision-making power. I'm pausing to see if there's anything else I want to name about that. The other thing I'll name is by ensuring the involvement of local leaders and community-based organizations, there's a greater capacity that the unique needs and the insights of that particular region will be woven into the conference. And all of those things that I just named, even before the unique needs and insights, fosters meaningful participation and creates greater impact. And then I just will reiterate, when using planning committees and advisory boards, it's just crucial to have clear, transparent communication throughout, clearly stating the roles, the responsibilities, the decision-making power, who ultimately has final say, how decisions will get communicated back to community-based members, how they'll be compensated for their time, and having all of that very clear before somebody even says yes to joining, so that they can choose for themselves, is this the best use of my time and resources? Is this the best fit? Is this going to allow me to be able to have the role that I want to have in this? With financial support, it is not going to be a surprise to y'all that I am going to say the recommendation is to ensure that comprehensive financial support is made available for a diversity of people with lived experience. That includes registration fees, it includes a per diem, whether the conference is virtual or in person, people are taking time away from other commitments, having the per diem up front so that somebody actually can just be fully present while something is happening, as opposed to thinking, oh, I've got to sort of, if they're navigating financial precarity, figure out how I'm going to cover my costs for this day until I get paid for it several weeks or a month after the gathering. Yes, there is the challenge that someone may not show. And from what I've heard from folks who do the per diems in advance, that's the exception. It's rare that someone doesn't show at all. And in the grand scheme of things, the sense of security having a per diem in advance provides for attendees is well worth it to do it in advance. Again, just want to pause and see if there's anything else around comprehensive financial support. There, there is a tension right now that there are some conferences held fully within an academic space. And the presumption in those spaces is that people attending are connected with an academic institution or an organization where their salary is paid for. And so, in some way, they're by default getting paid to attend the conference. And those conferences haven't yet figured out ways to compensate people who are speakers with lived experience who are not connected to formalized institutions or organizations. It's a room for opportunity, like opportunity to grow and think, okay, not everybody exists in this world in the same way, even though we're all experts and professionals, but not all of us have a academic institution or organization backing. And so what opportunities exist in those types of conferences to cover, to offer speaking fees for people with lived experience? There are some conferences that do that, so it is possible. There are others who haven't quite gotten to the point that they're willing to consider that, it feels like. And then I also will say a recommendation is that anytime labor is being performed in support of a conference, and I'm thinking in particular of peer support, people must be paid. There are a number of conferences where folks with lived experience are asked to be available for peer support and they're not paid. That's not a best practice. And yes, there is truth that each of us as individuals get to make decisions about when and how and where we're willing to work without getting paid, and when and where and how we expect to be paid. And I can hold that while also holding the reality that the onus of responsibility falls on host organizations, the ones who are convening the conferences. So if people know that they want to have emotional support available throughout the conference, they can work that into their budget in advance. And or if the budget they have, for whatever reason, doesn't cover that, they can find alternative funding sources, or they can name, because we don't have the funding, this is not available. It is not an emerging best practice to say, we do not have the budget, so we're going to ask people to do this for free, particularly when it's something as crucial as having in real time emotional support. So I think I'll pause there, although financial support's going to come up again in one of the other slides. So we'll just know we're linking back to this in terms of well-being. Let's think about fostering connection and accessibility and inclusivity. When thinking about hoped for outcomes for anti-trafficking conferences, the findings from the research that we conducted points to the need to evaluate whether there was a sense of belonging and connection fostered among the participants, and that with that identified as a needed outcome, that organizers in structuring and planning for a conference should prioritize creating spaces for dialogue and networking and relationship building throughout the conference, which I know that I'm actually confident. I'm actually confident that in all of the conferences I've attended over the past 20 years, it's a lot of conferences, and all the people I spoke with, all the wonderful people who provided feedback, everybody would say that to a certain extent they did that. And from the findings of this research, I would push all of us to say, how can we do it better? Particularly knowing that all of the conferences, except for one that I'm aware of, which was a smaller one, um, it had maybe around 20 attendees, so very intentional. If we exclude that one, all the other ones that I'm aware of and that I've attended still do that default model of we're going to cram a lot in. And if people get chances to dialogue and network and relationship build, it's because they're doing it during breaks that maybe the breaks aren't as long as we had hoped because sessions ran long. And that actually isn't the healing centered model that's going to best support connection and a sense of belonging. So it's thinking, how do we have workshops and sessions? How do we have breaks? How do we then have time that's for dialoguing and networking? That's separate for breaks, because most of us actually need our breaks to be able to then show up fully in conversation. So it's important that gatherings can become places where participants are not only seen and heard, but also uplifted and empowered to take on active roles that align with their self-identified goals. So this is what is um, actually needed to foster connection, to make things accessible, and to be inclusive, and to be healing centered. So recognizing that there's almost always people with lived experience at a conference, or in a meeting, even in a meeting related to anti-trafficking, whether or not people are aware of it, sort of begs the question of how our conference spaces, our meeting spaces might benefit, might actually make them more accessible and inclusive and rooted in a healing centered, trauma informed approach if we assumed that anyone we were speaking to or engaging with may have lived experience. And in this, I'm thinking of someone I interviewed who said that the majority of people who attended their conference did have lived experience. There were also those who didn't, but it was known from the get-go that the majority of people would. Also, almost everybody who attended had a speaking role. And this person noticed that there was just a different quality in terms of how people were interacting and talking because there was the attunement to shared humanity of, oh, I'm speaking to somebody who likely has experienced some type of harm or trauma. And I'm also speaking to somebody who's an expert. And I'm going to show up differently because of that, even though I don't know for certain what this person's story is. So it really does make me wonder, would our conference settings where our convenings be more attuned to our shared humanity if we were able to attend to that? And in some ways, that's going to link us to the beyond the binary. I'm thinking in particular about hearing from people who have not experienced trafficking, but have experienced other traumas. And they're naming how in anti-trafficking conferences and convenings, because their trauma experiences are adjacent to trafficking, they're getting stirred. And that they're recognizing that there's not the on-site or virtual support made available to them in the ways that it's made to people who are open, vocal about their lived experience. And they're beautifully naming, we don't want to, as folks without lived experience in trafficking, to be in an anti-trafficking conference space and pull resources support away from people who've experienced trafficking. But it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. If we attune to healing-centered engagement, if we attune to our shared humanity, then we know that people with an array of trauma histories and experiences are showing up in our spaces. And getting support should not be limited only to one particular type of trauma. So if our conferences could begin to explore ways to move away from this binary view that separates people into survivors or allies, while also attending to the reality that at different times it is important to have spaces where it's only folks with lived experience. It's important to have spaces where there's a blending of folks. There's an importance to having times where it's people with a very particular type of lived experience within the larger umbrella. That we can do all of that, that we can recognize the intersectionality of our identities, and that to really create an inclusive environment, we have to attend to that intersectionality. It also, you know, as I mentioned already, but I'm going to reiterate, points to the need for trauma-informed and healing-centered approaches for everybody who's attending the conference. I'm going to pause once more just to see if there's anything else around this binary, this false binary that I want to bring up. The other thing to name, I'm thinking about a conversation that came out of the World Congress presentation, is the opportunity. And again, this takes effort. And in many ways, this is true in any type of community rooted based participatory approach. It always takes longer than, okay, we're just going to bring a bunch of people together for this conference. We're going to hope it goes well. We're going to have some things in place to hopefully support that. And then everybody's going to disperse. A, a, an approach that's rooted in participatory styles will do work before people even show up, in recognition that that will support the container of the conference. And so what was named by somebody, it was a question, a beautiful question of, I'm not quite sure how to navigate the reality of some of the spaces that I move through, I being this person who is speaking, where maybe one person stands up who has lived experience, is very adamant about what is the best policy response or approach. And then someone else with lived experience gets up and has a completely different opinion about that. How do I know which one to listen to? And just as there is the binary of survivor and ally, the false binary within anti-trafficking spaces, what we're also hearing are the ways in which certain voices get prioritized and welcomed and included in conferences, and other voices and perspectives aren't. And some people are doing that intentionally because they recognize we don't have the capacity to deal with the conflict and the tensions that come up when we get into policy discussions. Other places are doing it intentionally because they don't want to hear other perspectives. They aren't open to be challenged. And then others, it's because they just either aren't thinking about it and or aren't um, building into, this is probably the better way to phrase it, the planning process, how to create the structure needed for conference attendees with those attendees before the conference even happens. What are the community agreements, developing this collectively? How are we going to navigate disagreement? Because there's going to be disagreement. How are we going to value different perspectives? How are we going to voice our perspectives without doing it in a way that's dismissive of someone else's perspective? So there's also moving beyond that binary, the sort of false binaries of this idea that there's a unified voice and perspective among people who have experienced trafficking, because there's not. And then to finalize in terms of recommendations, and then we'll wrap up, is maintaining post-conference momentum. There is just a significant amount of time and effort and resources that go into planning and implementing a conference. For people attending, it's a big commitment, either financially, taking the time out, maybe they're speakers, maybe it's being in a space where it reminds us of traumas we've experienced. So there's a psychological impact of it as well. And to go through all of that and then at the end have it be like dandelion seeds in the wind that all disperse without any attention to what are the post-conference plans to maintain momentum is a disservice. So the impact of a conference should not end when the event concludes. Organizers should develop follow-up plans that include continued engagement with attendees. So these are things that have to be thought of before the conference even happens. What are our post-conference plans? What are our plans for sharing the key things that were talked about? What are the ways in which during the conference we want to see if there are different groups that are organically coming out of these discussions who want to continue the momentum and the work around a particular area? What are the scheduled check-ins or virtual meetings we may need to support that? And what are the opportunities for collaboration and continued learning and professional development that will ensure lasting change? So to wrap up with thank yous, in conclusion, the findings from this research highlight the importance of adopting a healing-centered approach to anti-trafficking conferences. And by involving people with with lived experience at every stage of planning, implementation, coordination, post-event dynamics, providing adequate financial and logistical support, and creating safer and more inclusive environments, conferences have the potential to become more responsive to the needs of those with lived experience. By prioritizing holistic wellness for all attendees, fostering meaningful connections, and maintaining post-conference momentum, those are all essential for ensuring that these events lead to sustained action and positive change. And with these recommendations, the anti-trafficking sector can continue to evolve and create conferences that are not only informative and impactful, but also transformative for all participants. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. If you made it this far, I am deeply grateful to you. And as I mentioned, I'm recording this November 1st, 2024. I am not sure in this moment when the final report will be shared. Hopefully it will be shared very in close proximity whenever this is shared, and that'll be available. And then I'm hoping that by hearing this sort of top level overview of some of the key findings and recommendations, that it's inspired you to want to check out the full report. I'm biased, of course, because I did the research and I wrote it. And I also know personally, I benefit so much from being able to read the perspectives of a variety of folks. And so the report includes many more quotes from people than I was able to include here. And I want to thank the people who participated in the one-on-one interviews, the planning committee members who participated in the focus groups, as well as the people who attended my session at the World Congress and who had informal conversations with me, who provided feedback, the individual interview, focus group participants, World Congress attendees who provided feedback on the draft report. It's because of all y'all that I was able to do what I was able to do, and this wouldn't exist without you. And then as I mentioned briefly earlier in the presentation, I welcome any and all feedback that you may have as someone who has watched or listened to this presentation. So on this slide, this thank you slide, you'll see my email address. It's Alix, ALIX .LUTNICK @gmail.com. That email is always active. Sometimes it does take me a little bit to respond, but I do get back to people. And if anything has come up for you that you want to share, things that resonated, things you found troubling, things you thought you would hear but you didn't, asterisk at the end of that is if you thought something would come up and it hasn't, if you have the capacity and if it's available, please check out the final report because it might be in there. Otherwise, if you don't have the capacity for whatever reason, feel free to email. If it is in the final report, I'll say, oh, check out this page, or oh, yeah, I spoke to that. And if anything, whether you have lived experience with trafficking or some other experience that was harmful, if there's anything that's come up that you would like someone to hold space for you in a non-licensed therapeutic way, I can be available for that too. To me, that's part of really honoring a healing-centered engagement is recognizing even something like this can create a response. And we're best served when we get to show up fully and authentically and vulnerably in these spaces and to have that met with care and reverence and respect. I'm going to stop share so that the slides zoom out. And I just want to thank everybody once more for your time and for this opportunity to share the research findings with you and wishing everybody optimal well-being. Bye.